Abandoned police dog saves a baby trapped in a well. But what the baby was holding shocks everyone. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. A cold wind blew across the abandoned construction site, rustling the tall grass and causing debris to shift. It had been years since anyone had set foot in this forgotten place. The rusting steel beams and cracked concrete stood as silent reminders of a project left unfinished. A storm had just passed, leaving the ground wet and treacherous. From the shadows of the ruins, a lone figure emerged, a dog. His coat was a mix of black and brown, speckled with dirt and dried mud. A faded police harness clung to his frame, a remnant of a past life. His eyes, intelligent and sharp, scanned the area as if searching for something. He sniffed the air, ears perking up, and then trotted forward with a sense of urgency. A faint cry echoed through the site, barely audible over the whistling wind. The dog stopped dead in his tracks. His ears twitched as he listened intently. There it was again, a weak, desperate whimper. Without hesitation, he followed the sound, his paws splashing through puddles and kicking up loose gravel. As he rounded a pile of broken bricks, he found the source of the cry. A deep, open well lay before him, its stone walls slick with moss and rainwater. He crept closer and peered inside. At the bottom, a baby, barely a year old, lay shivering. Wrapped in nothing but a thin cloth, the child's tiny fingers grasped a golden ring, glinting even in the dim light. The baby's wide, teary eyes locked onto the dog, as if recognizing him as the only hope of salvation. The dog barked, a sharp, commanding sound that carried through the site. He barked again, louder this time, hoping someone, anyone, would hear. But the construction site was deserted. There were no workers, no bystanders, only silence. Instinct kicked in. The dog paced around the well, assessing the situation. The baby was too far down for him to reach. He let out another series of barks, but still no response. Then he made a decision. Turning on his heels, he sprinted toward the city, his paws pounding against the pavement. He navigated the streets with precision, weaving through alleys and dodging traffic. He knew exactly where to go. A few blocks away, Officer Daniel Hayes sat in his patrol car, sipping his now lukewarm coffee. It had been a quiet shift, a rare moment of calm in the bustling city. He leaned back, about to take another sip when a familiar bark shattered the silence. Daniel's heart clenched as he recognized the sound. He turned his head just in time to see the black and brown dog bounding toward him. His old partner. Axel? He whispered in disbelief. Axel hadn't been seen for months. The police dog had gone missing after a raid gone wrong, presumed lost or worse. Yet here he was, his harness still intact but his eyes filled with desperation. Axel barked again, pawing at the ground before turning and running a few feet away, then stopping, looking back as if waiting. Daniel's instincts flared. He knew that look. Axel wanted him to follow. Without hesitation, he threw his coffee aside, turned on the siren, and hit the gas. Axel led him through winding streets, back to the construction site. Daniel slammed the car into park, leapt out, and followed the dog toward the well. The moment Daniel peered inside, his breath caught in his throat. "Jesus," he muttered. "There's a baby in there." He whipped out his radio. "This is Officer Hayes. I need emergency backup at the old Sterling construction site. We have an infant trapped in a well. I repeat, an infant trapped in a well. Requesting immediate rescue team." Axel barked anxiously, circling the well. Daniel knew they had to act fast. Minutes later, the wail of sirens filled the air. Firefighters, paramedics, and additional officers poured into the site, setting up lights and securing ropes. The rescue team lowered a harness, one of the firefighters volunteering to go down. The moment he reached the baby, he paused. "You're not going to believe this," he said, voice cracking through the radio. "The baby, it's holding a solid gold ring. This thing looks ancient." Daniel frowned. "A ring?" "Yeah," the firefighter confirmed. I've never seen anything like it. Slowly, carefully, he secured the baby in the harness and gave the signal. As the team hoisted them back up, Daniel reached out, taking the tiny bundle into his arms. The baby clung to him, still clutching the golden ring in its tiny fist. Axel whined, nudging Daniel's knee. "You did good, buddy," Daniel murmured, running a hand through Axel's fur. "You saved a life today." But as he looked at the ring, a deep unease settled in his gut. Something about it felt off. The engravings, the craftsmanship, it was unlike anything he had ever seen. And then, the baby, barely strong enough to move, lifted its eyes and did something that made Daniel's blood run cold. It whispered, "More below." Here's the next batch of 1,500 words in a flowing script format. The murmured words sent a chill down Daniel's spine. The baby's voice was barely audible, more like a breath than a whisper, but he had heard it. He wasn't even sure if the infant was fully conscious, but there was no mistaking what it had said. "More below." Daniel looked around at the rescue crew, but no one else seemed to have noticed. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe the exhaustion of the night was playing tricks on his mind. But Axel's ears perked up, and the dog let out a low, uneasy growl as he stared down into the well. Something about that ring, the one clenched so tightly in the baby's tiny fist, made Daniel uneasy. It was a deep gold, almost unnaturally vibrant in the dim construction site lighting. The intricate carvings along its surface looked ancient, symbols Daniel didn't recognize, swirling patterns that seemed to shift in the flickering emergency lights. "What's the situation, officer?" One of the paramedics, a woman named Evelyn, stepped up to check the baby's vitals. "He's stable," Daniel muttered, still staring at the well. "But there's something strange." Evelyn raised an eyebrow but didn't press the issue. Instead, she gently unwrapped the baby from the damp cloth and checked for any injuries. Miraculously, no broken bones, just a little hypothermic. "We'll need to get him to the hospital, but he's lucky. If it weren't for your dog." She paused. "Wait a second. What's that in his hand?" Daniel exhaled sharply. "That's what I want to know." Gently, Evelyn pried the ring from the baby's tiny fingers. The moment she did, the child let out a sudden, piercing cry that made everyone flinch. It wasn't just a normal baby's wail. It was something deeper, almost primal, filled with distress. Axel barked sharply, his body tensed as if sensing a threat. Evelyn hesitated but managed to place the ring in Daniel's hand. The instant his fingers wrapped around the cool metal, he felt something. It wasn't just cold. It was heavy, but not in weight. More like it carried something within it, something old. The engravings pulsed beneath his fingertips, almost as if they were alive. A strange sensation washed over him, like a pressure in the air had shifted. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, and then the ground shook. It wasn't strong enough to send anyone tumbling, but it was unmistakable. A deep, guttural rumbling came from the depths of the well, a sound that didn't belong to the earth. Every rescuer froze in place, exchanging uncertain glances. "What the hell was that?" one firefighter muttered. Daniel turned to the firefighter who had gone down into the well. "Are you sure you checked everything down there?" His voice was tight, controlled, but his gut was screaming that they had missed something. The man nodded but looked uneasy. "I didn't see anything else, just the baby. But now that you mention it, I did feel something weird. The walls weren't solid in some places, almost like there were tunnels." Daniel felt his pulse quicken. "We need to go back down." Whoa, hold up." The fire chief, a broad-shouldered man named Warren, stepped in. "We just pulled a baby out of there. You're saying there's more? And what exactly are you expecting to find?" Daniel opened his mouth but hesitated. How was he supposed to explain this? That the baby had whispered about something deeper? That an ancient-looking ring had set off what felt like a tremor? That Axel, a trained police dog, was staring into that hole like there was something down there staring back? He settled for, "I don't know, but I have a bad feeling about this." The fire chief sighed but nodded. "All right, I'll send someone down again. But if it's just old piping or loose rock, we're sealing this place off." The firefighter who had previously descended, Parker, reluctantly volunteered to go back down. He fastened his harness and grabbed a high-powered flashlight. As they lowered him, everyone waited in tense silence. Minutes passed. Parker's voice crackled through the radio. "I'm back at the bottom. Flashlight's stronger now. I can see more clearly." Pause. "Holy shit." Daniel grabbed the radio. What do you see?" Parker's breathing was uneven. There's a passage. It's not natural. The stone is carved, like it was built. I see steps leading down." Daniel's blood turned to ice. "How far?" he asked. Parker hesitated. "I don't know. It disappears into the dark. It's old, though. Really old." And his voice cut off for a second, static interrupting the feed. Then, in a much quieter, unsteady tone, he whispered, "I think I hear something moving down here." Axel's growl deepened, his body tense. "Pull him up," Daniel ordered immediately. There was a moment of hesitation, and then Parker's voice, now sharp with fear, shouted, "Something's down here with me." The rope jerked as the team above yanked Parker back up with urgency. The moment his boots cleared the edge of the well, he scrambled backward, his face pale and drenched in sweat. His flashlight clattered to the ground. "There's something down there," he gasped. "I didn't see it, but I could hear it. Breathing. Big. And the walls, there were more carvings. More of those damn symbols, like the ones on the ring." Everyone stood in stunned silence. Daniel turned his gaze back to the baby in Evelyn's arms. The child had stopped crying the moment Parker had been pulled up. Its tiny fingers curled in the air, as if reaching for the ring again. Daniel looked at Axel, then at the well. They had only scratched the surface. Something had been left behind. And now, after all these years, it was waking up. The air was thick with tension, a silence settling over the rescue crew as they absorbed Parker's words. No one spoke, but every set of eyes flicked back to the gaping maw of the well, now more ominous than ever. The earth below them hid secrets, secrets that none of them were prepared to face. Daniel's fingers tightened around the ring. The longer he held it, the more it felt like it was pulsing, almost like a heartbeat. He wanted to let go, to drop it, but something deep inside told him that wasn't an option. Whatever this was, he was tied to it now. Parker sat on the ground, catching his breath, his eyes darting from face to face. "I swear to God, I heard breathing down there, and it wasn't human." The fire chief exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand down his face. "All right, listen. We've got an unexplored underground structure, an unidentified presence, and a damn baby that survived down there. We're not equipped for this. I'm calling it in." Daniel didn't argue. This had moved far beyond a rescue mission. Evelyn, still holding the baby, had turned pale. "We need to get him to the hospital first," she reminded them. "Whatever is happening here, this child needs help." Daniel nodded. "Take him. We'll stay behind." She hesitated, glancing at the well, then at Daniel. "You should come too. Whatever's happening here, it's dangerous." He wanted to. Every part of him screamed to walk away. Let the experts handle whatever this was. But then he looked down at Axel. The police dog's hackles were still raised. His gaze locked onto the well like he was expecting something to crawl out. And deep down, Daniel knew this wasn't over. The baby let out a soft noise as Evelyn handed him off to the ambulance crew. As they placed him in the vehicle, the child's tiny fingers grasped at the air, reaching for something unseen. The ring burned cold in Daniel's hand. Then, just as the ambulance doors closed, the baby's lips moved again. Daniel barely caught it. "Don't let them out." The words sent a shudder through him. "Wait," Daniel called, but the ambulance was already pulling away. Parker looked at him, face pale. "What did he say?" Daniel hesitated. "Nothing. It's nothing," but it wasn't nothing. He turned back to the well. The air felt different now, thicker, charged. The fire chief was already on his radio, calling in reinforcements, explaining the situation in the most rational way possible. Underground chambers, possible tunnel collapse, unknown hazards. But even he knew that wasn't the truth. Daniel took a step closer to the well. Axel growled low in his throat. Parker swallowed hard. "You're not seriously thinking of going down there?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. He just stared into the darkness. Then, finally, he murmured, "I need to see it for myself." 15 minutes later, Daniel was strapped into a harness, Parker beside him. The fire chief wasn't happy about it, but after hearing what Daniel had said, about the baby's whisper, about the warning, he wasn't willing to ignore the possibility that there was more to this than just some historical ruins. The team slowly lowered them into the well. The deeper they went, the more Daniel felt the cold. Not just physical cold, but something deeper, more unsettling. Axel whined from above. When their feet touched solid ground, Daniel switched on his flashlight. The beams illuminated the passage Parker had seen before. And now, standing there, Daniel understood the terror. The passage wasn't natural. It was built. The stone was old, so old it looked fused into the earth itself. The carvings along the walls weren't just symbols. They were figures, people, and they were kneeling, their hands outstretched, almost as if in worship or surrender. Parker exhaled. "Jesus." Daniel stepped forward, his boots crunching on ancient dirt. His flashlight followed the path deeper, revealing a massive door at the end of the corridor. It was carved from the same stone, seamless, but there were no hinges, no handle, and in the center, a hole. Daniel felt his breath catch in his throat. Parker saw it too. "That looks like the ring." Daniel slowly lifted his hand, staring at the object that still pulsed against his palm. "This is a key," he murmured. Parker took a step back. "Daniel, I don't think you should." But it was too late. The moment Daniel raised the ring toward the door, the carvings along the stone lit up. A deep rumbling echoed through the chamber, dust cascading from above. And then, the door moved. It wasn't a mechanical movement, not like a vault unlocking. It was alive. The stone peeled back, almost as if something was parting the earth itself. And beyond it, darkness, endless, swallowing darkness. Then the sound came. Not breathing, whispers, hundreds of them. Daniel's grip on the ring tightened. Something was waiting, and now it knew they were here. The air inside the underground chamber felt thick, like it had weight. Daniel could hear his own breath, too loud in his ears. Parker stood frozen beside him, his flashlight shaking in his grip. The whispers continued, layered, distorted, as if coming from different voices overlapping one another. Daniel forced himself to focus on the door. It was no longer a solid slab of stone, but something living, shifting ever so slightly, almost like it was breathing. The carvings on the walls continued to glow with an eerie, pulsating light, casting flickering shadows that seemed to move on their own. Axel barked above, frantic. Parker swallowed hard. "Daniel, we need to go." Daniel's grip on the ring tightened. Every rational part of his brain screamed to listen to Parker, to get the hell out of there. But then the whispers changed. They knew his name. "Daniel?" The sound slithered through the air, not from one voice, but from many. Parker's face turned ghostly pale. "Did you?" "I heard it," Daniel whispered, and then the darkness beyond the door shifted. At first, it looked like the shadows themselves were crawling, like ink swirling in water. But then shapes began to emerge. Figures, human-like, but wrong. Their limbs were too long. Their eyes, if they even had eyes, were only hollow voids, absorbing the light instead of reflecting it. Daniel's pulse pounded in his throat. His fingers twitched around the ring. One of the figures moved forward. It didn't walk. It floated. And then, in a voice that was too deep, too ancient, it spoke. "Return it." Daniel felt something press against his chest. Not physically, but mentally. Like an unseen force was trying to invade his thoughts, to pull something from him. He staggered back, breathing hard. Parker grabbed his arm. "Daniel, we are leaving." But before they could turn, something lashed out. Not a hand, not a shadow, but something unseen, something that grabbed Daniel's mind. It was a memory, but not his. He saw flashes, ancient figures kneeling before the door, their hands raised toward the ring. He saw fear in their eyes, not of the thing inside, but of the ones outside, as if they had sealed something away to protect themselves. And then, the last vision, the baby, not crying, not afraid, but watching, waiting. Daniel snapped back to reality with a gasp. His knees buckled. Parker caught him, shaking him. What the hell just happened? Daniel couldn't speak. His mind was still reeling from what he had seen. But one thing was clear now. The ring, it wasn't just a key. It was a lock. And if they weren't careful, something was about to be set free. Above them, Axel's barking became more frantic. Daniel looked up toward the opening of the well, where the fire chief and the other rescue crew were peering down, their faces etched with concern. "Get them out of there," someone shouted. Parker didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed Daniel's arm, practically dragging him back toward the rope. But as soon as they moved, the whispers turned to screams. The figures in the darkness lunged forward. The moment they did, everything shook. The walls, the ceiling, the very ground beneath them. "Go!" Parker shouted. Daniel forced his body to move, his boots scraping against the ancient stone. He shoved the ring into his pocket, his hands grasping the rope as he and Parker hoisted themselves up. Axel's barking was ear-piercing now. As they ascended, a force unlike anything Daniel had ever felt pulled at him. It wasn't physical, but it was there. A presence trying to drag him back down. His muscles burned. His breath came in ragged gasps. Parker climbed ahead, kicking wildly at nothing, at something unseen. The well rumbled around them. Then, just as they neared the surface, Daniel made the mistake of looking down. And he saw it. Something was coming. Not just the shadowed figures. Something larger. Something that had been waiting. Something that had been sealed away for centuries. And now it had woken up, above ground. The moment Daniel and Parker breached the surface, the rescue team grabbed them, yanking them away from the well. Axel lunged forward, snarling, standing between Daniel and the gaping hole in the earth. And then, the ground collapsed. Not just the well, the entire area around it. The stone, the dirt. It caved inward, swallowed whole by something beneath. Daniel scrambled back, his chest heaving, watching as the well vanished into darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a deep, earth-shaking growl erupted from below. Not human, not even remotely human. Something else had woken up, and it was hungry. The fire chief grabbed Daniel by the shoulders. "What the hell is going on?" Daniel's lips parted, but no words came out. Because how could he explain? How could he tell them that whatever had been down there wasn't supposed to get out? That the baby had been a warning, a last remnant of those who had sealed it away, and worst of all, that it wasn't alone. Axel whimpered, ears flattened, and Daniel, staring into the darkness, realized the horrible truth. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. The tremors had stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse. It wasn't just the kind of silence that came when things settled. It was a void, a space where something had once been contained and was now missing. Daniel could feel it. Axel was still tense, his fur bristling, his body rigid. He wasn't growling anymore, but his eyes remained locked on the gaping hole where the well had once been. Parker was hunched over, hands on his knees, panting hard. The fire chief was shouting at someone, demanding answers. People were moving around, but Daniel barely heard them. All he could think about was what he had seen just before they escaped. That thing, that presence. It hadn't been human. It had been waiting, and now it was out. Daniel swallowed hard, forcing himself to stand on shaking legs. He reached into his pocket, feeling for the ring. It was still there, cool against his fingers. And then, just for a second, it was warm. His breath hitched. Parker straightened up beside him. "Dude," he whispered, "we need to tell someone." Daniel turned to him, his mind racing. "Tell them what? That we just accidentally freed something ancient and possibly malevolent? That the baby in the visions had been a warning, and not just some relic of the past?" No one would believe them, and honestly, he barely believed it himself. Before he could answer, Axel whimpered. Daniel looked down, and his stomach twisted. The fur along the dog's back was still standing, but that wasn't what made Daniel's chest tighten. Axel wasn't just staring at the hole anymore. He was backing away from it, slowly, step by step. And when Daniel followed his gaze, his blood turned ice cold. Something was moving, not in the hole, in the shadows beyond it. At first, Daniel thought it was just a trick of the light. The sun had started to set, and the long, stretched-out shadows from the trees made it hard to see clearly. But then it moved again, not fast, not sudden, but deliberate. Parker saw it too. "Tell me that's a firefighter," he whispered. Daniel knew it wasn't. The figure wasn't wearing a uniform. It wasn't wearing anything. And as it shifted just slightly closer to the fading light, Daniel saw the one thing that made every single muscle in his body lock up. No eyes, just hollow spaces where eyes should have been. The whispers returned. Soft, faint, barely there. "Daniel," he stumbled back. Parker cursed under his breath. "Dude, we have to." Then the radios exploded with static. Every firefighter, every rescue worker, everyone's radios crackled at once. Voices, broken transmissions, flickering, distorted words bleeding through layers of interference. But Daniel understood one. "It's coming." The moment the words snapped into clarity, the entire tree line shifted. The figure wasn't alone. Daniel grabbed Parker's arm. "Run." He didn't wait, didn't stop to explain. He just ran. And so did Parker. Axel bolted ahead of them, his instincts kicking in before theirs ever could. Behind them, the whispers rose into a deafening cacophony. Daniel didn't dare look back, because he already knew. They weren't supposed to leave, and now they were being hunted. The road was empty. Daniel didn't know how far they had run. It could have been minutes or hours, but when they finally stopped, their lungs were burning, their legs aching, and their hands shaking. Axel had stopped running first, standing in the middle of the dirt road, ears pinned back, chest heaving. Parker leaned against a rusted fence post, dragging a hand down his face. I don't," he sucked in a sharp breath. "Dude, what the hell was that?" Daniel couldn't answer, because he didn't know. His heart was still pounding in his chest, his body still humming with adrenaline. Axel let out a low growl. Daniel turned, expecting to see those figures again, those things, but there was nothing. Just the road, the trees, the wind. Everything looked normal, but that was the problem. It shouldn't, because Daniel knew that just beyond that tree line, something was awake, and it had let them leave. For now. Parker finally looked up, his face pale. "We need to go back." Daniel stared at him like he had lost his mind. "What?" Parker swallowed. "We can't just leave this thing out there, man. We let it out. What if it..." Daniel shook his head. "No, you saw it. We barely got out alive. Whatever that was, it wasn't just a ghost or some weird hallucination. It was real. That's exactly why we can't just..." "Parker," Daniel snapped, voice sharper than he meant. "We don't even know what we're dealing with." Parker opened his mouth, then closed it. Daniel sighed, dragging a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. "Look, I don't know what's happening. I don't know what we saw. But I do know one thing, we weren't supposed to survive." Parker flinched. Daniel hated saying it, but it was the truth. Something in that chamber, in that well, in that ring had let them go. But for how long? Axel growled again, this time lower, deeper. Daniel followed his gaze. His stomach dropped. At the edge of the tree line, where the shadows met the road, something stood watching. Not the figures from before. Something else. Something taller. Something that was smiling. Parker saw it too. His breath hitched. Daniel felt a cold chill crawl down his spine. It hadn't followed them. It had been waiting. And suddenly Daniel understood. They hadn't escaped. They had been led. And now, whatever had been buried wanted them to know. This wasn't over. The road stretched out before them, eerily quiet under the weight of the moment. The sky was darkening now, and the last glow of the sunset barely touched the edges of the trees. Everything felt different, as if the world had shifted slightly, just enough to make Daniel feel like he wasn't standing in the same reality he had woken up in this morning. Axel was still growling, his stance rigid. Parker, next to him, hadn't moved much either, his breath still uneven. And that thing in the shadows? It was still watching. Daniel's fingers dug into his pockets, his body tense, waiting. Then the wind shifted. The moment it did, the figure vanished. Not stepped away, not disappeared into the tree line, just gone, like it had never been there. But Daniel knew better. Parker exhaled a shaky breath, rubbing his arms like he was trying to fight off a chill that had settled deep into his bones. I swear to God, dude, I'm gonna lose my mind. Daniel understood the feeling. His own thoughts felt scattered, like they'd been ripped apart and thrown into some impossible puzzle that didn't fit together. But something inside him knew that wasn't the end, not even close. He reached into his pocket again, fingers brushing against the cool metal of the ring. He hadn't let go of it since the well collapsed. Every time he thought about dropping it, something deep inside him screamed not to. Not yet. Daniel, Parker's voice was softer now, wary. We can't just leave this. We can't pretend it didn't happen. Daniel knew he was right, but what were they supposed to do? Go back? Face whatever was still lurking in the ruins? Or worse, find out what it wanted? Before he could answer, Axel tensed again, his head snapping to the left. Daniel didn't want to look, but he had to, because this time they weren't alone. The road, which had been so eerily empty just a second ago, was now lined with people. No, not people. Figures, standing in perfect silence. They weren't moving, they weren't blinking, and they weren't human. Parker took a stumbling step back. Daniel? Daniel's throat was dry. His heart was pounding. Axel let out a low whimper. The figures were watching them, waiting. Daniel didn't dare breathe. And then they stepped forward. All at once. Run. Daniel didn't know if he had shouted it or just thought it. But he ran. Parker was right beside him, sprinting so fast that he nearly tripped over his own feet. Axel was already ahead, a blur of fur and motion. But behind them, the figures were moving too. Not running, not chasing, just walking. But the problem was they didn't need to run, because every time Daniel's foot hit the pavement, the figures were closer. Every step, every breath, closer. He risked a glance over his shoulder. Bad idea. One of them, one too close, turned its head toward him. Its neck cracked unnaturally, and for the first time, Daniel saw its mouth move. No sound, just shifting lips, repeating something, over and over. And then Daniel heard it, not through his ears, but inside his own head. Give it back. His stomach dropped. The ring. This was about the ring. But before Daniel could even think about what that meant, Parker grabbed his arm. There, Parker's voice was sharp, panicked. The truck. Daniel looked up, and sure enough, their old, beaten-down pickup was just ahead. He pushed harder. They could make it. They could. Something grabbed him. It wasn't hands. It wasn't anything solid. It was like the air itself had clamped down around him. Daniel choked on his own breath. His body seized. His legs locked. Parker screamed his name. Axel barked wildly. Daniel tried to fight it, tried to move, but the pressure was everywhere. It was inside him, wrapping around his bones, crushing his ribs. The voices, the whispers, they were louder now. Give it back. Give it back. Give it back. The pressure turned to pain. Daniel clenched his teeth, his vision darkening. His fingers spasmed. And then the ring burned. Daniel barely registered the sharp sting against his palm before. It stopped. The whispers, the pressure, everything. Daniel hit the pavement hard, gasping as if he had been drowning. The figures, they were gone, like they had never been there. Parker skidded to a stop next to him, dropping down and grabbing his shoulders. Daniel, what the hell just... Daniel held up his hand. The ring, it was still there. But now it wasn't just cool metal. It was glowing, and it was humming. Parker stared at it, eyes wide. Dude, Daniel couldn't breathe. Something was coming, and this time they might not escape. The glow from the ring pulsed softly, illuminating Daniel's palm with an eerie light. It was dim, barely noticeable under the flickering street lamp overhead, but he could feel it. A low vibration, almost like a heartbeat, thrummed against his skin. Parker was still kneeling beside him, his breathing ragged. His eyes darted between the ring and the empty road behind them, where the figures had vanished. Axel whined softly, ears pinned back. "Dude," Parker finally croaked, voice shaking. "What the hell just happened?" Daniel couldn't answer. His throat was too dry. His brain was too tangled with the reality of what he had just experienced. The voices, the pressure, the feeling of something reaching into his very being. And now this ring, still humming, still glowing, still waiting. Daniel forced himself to breathe, curling his fingers around the metal. For a moment he thought about throwing it, hurling it into the darkness, into the abyss, where it had belonged. But something deep inside him whispered against it. Not yet. Not until he knew. Not until he understood why. "We need to go." Parker's voice was stronger now, more urgent. "Now, Daniel." Daniel nodded, his legs still weak as he forced himself up. Parker gripped his arm, steadying him, his face lined with worry. Neither of them spoke as they stumbled toward the truck. Every shadow felt wrong. Every shift in the wind felt like a whisper against their ears. And the ring? It was getting warmer. The truck door slammed shut, and Parker exhaled heavily, gripping the wheel with white-knuckled hands. Axel had scrambled into the back seat, panting hard. Daniel just sat there, staring at his palm. It had stopped glowing. It looked like nothing more than a simple, worn-out piece of jewelry. But he knew better. Parker threw the truck into gear, tires screeching against the pavement as they pulled onto the road. He didn't look back. Daniel did, and for a second he regretted it, because standing at the edge of the tree line, just barely visible in the rearview mirror, they were still watching. They didn't stop driving until the town was long behind them. The winding road stretched through the valley, the dense forest pressing against either side like a silent audience. The headlights carved a thin path through the darkness, but beyond that, there was nothing. No signs of life, no figures, no voices, just the quiet hum of the truck's engine and the lingering weight of what had happened. Parker gripped the wheel so tight his knuckles had turned white. "Dude," he muttered under his breath, "we are so screwed." Daniel pressed his forehead against the cold glass of the window. "Yeah." A heavy silence followed. Axel shifted in the back seat, his ears flicking at every little sound, his body still tense. And then Parker sighed. "So are we just gonna pretend that was some kind of, I don't know, hallucination?" He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Because I gotta be honest, man. I'm out of explanations." Daniel lifted his hand, staring at the ring once more. The glow was gone, the hum was gone, but the feeling remained. It wasn't just a ring, it was something else. And whatever it was, it had called to him. "We need to find out where it came from," Daniel said quietly. Parker shot him a sideways glance. "Are you insane? That thing almost killed you." Daniel shook his head. "I don't think it was trying to kill me." Parker blinked. "Excuse me?" Daniel ran his thumb over the cool metal, his heartbeat steadying for the first time since they had left the well. "I think it was trying to warn me." Parker didn't speak for a long time. The truck rolled along the empty road, the hum of the tires the only sound between them. Then, finally, Parker cursed under his breath. "Of course," he muttered. "Of course you'd say some cryptic crap like that." Daniel almost smiled, because as terrifying as it was, he was right. Something was coming, and whatever it was, it wasn't done with them yet. They pulled into Parker's driveway just past midnight. The house was dark, the front porch light flickering slightly against the wind. Daniel stepped out first, his body still aching from whatever had happened to him back on the road. Axel followed close, his tail low. Parker let out another sigh, rubbing his face. "All right, man. What now?" Daniel hesitated, and then he made a decision. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. There was only one person who might have the answers, and if he was right, they didn't have much time. His fingers hovered over the screen, and then he dialed. The line rang, once, twice, and then a voice answered. low, gravelly, and far too awake for this hour. Daniel, the voice murmured. I was wondering when you'd call. Daniel froze. Parker looked at him, confused. Who is it? Daniel swallowed. And then the voice on the line spoke again. I see you found it. A pause. Then soft laughter. That means it's already started. Parker tensed the moment he saw Daniel's face go pale. He could hear the voice on the other end, though it was too muffled to make out the words. But he didn't need to hear it, he could feel it. Something about this whole situation had changed the second Daniel had answered that call. Parker had spent his entire life trusting his gut. And right now, his gut was screaming that they were standing at the edge of something big. Axel whined softly beside them, his ears twitching, his nose sniffing at the air as if sensing something neither of them could. Daniel's grip on the phone tightened. Who are you? His voice was low, but steady. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a quiet chuckle. We don't have time for introductions, the voice said, smooth and calm, like they were discussing the weather and not something that had nearly killed Daniel just hours ago. You need to listen carefully. The ring, it's not what you think it is. Daniel's stomach twisted. He didn't even know what he thought it was. All he knew was that it wasn't normal. Then what is it? He asked, stepping further onto the porch. Parker followed, his pulse hammering in his throat. The voice on the other end sighed, as if choosing the right words. A key. A cold shiver ran down Daniel's spine. He looked at Parker, whose brows furrowed in confusion. A key to what? Daniel asked, his mouth suddenly dry. Another pause, this time longer. Then the voice said, something that should have never been locked away. The words sat heavy between them. Parker scoffed, his patience snapping. Oh, come on. Enough with the cryptic crap. Either tell us what's going on or hang up. But the voice remained unshaken. You don't understand, they said, a strange edge to their tone now. It chose you. That means they're coming. Daniel's breath hitched. His thoughts raced back to the figures in the road, the ones that had disappeared like shadows melting into the dark. He could still feel the weight of their presence, like an echo clinging to his skin. Who's coming? He whispered, gripping the phone tighter. The ones who lost it, the voice answered, just as the porch light flickered above them. The air grew still. The temperature seemed to drop. Axel let out a low growl, his body stiff. Parker stiffened, his instincts flaring. Daniel, he warned. The voice on the other end continued as if unaware of the sudden shift around them. You need to move. Now, you're not safe there anymore. Daniel's heart pounded in his ears. He exchanged a look with Parker, and in that instant they both knew the person on the phone was right. Something was wrong. The silence in the air wasn't just silence. It was waiting, watching, and then, as if confirming their worst fears, the front door behind them creaked open on its own. The both of them spun around, adrenaline spiking, but there was nothing there. Just darkness. Just the house, empty, quiet, too quiet. Axel bared his teeth. The voice on the phone remained calm, but this time, there was urgency. Run,